My name is Sue Edworthy, and welcome to Decolonizing the Practice, the sixth in a series of webinars designed to build the capacity of Canadian consultants working in the arts and culture sector as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm a member of the Volunteer Board of Directors for Arts Consultant Canada. Before we begin, we wish to recognize that the members of Arts Consultants Canada are honored to live and work on the traditional territory of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people from coast to coast to coast, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We acknowledge the historical oppression of their lands and cultures in what we now know as Canada, and fervently believe the arts contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey we all share together. We honor their long history of welcoming many other peoples to this beautiful territory, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work here. I am zooming in from the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. This territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for resources around the Great Lakes. For those who do not know, Arts Consultants Canada is the National Association of Professional Consultants working in the arts. For the past 17 years, we have served as a community of practice for individual consultants who work to support Canada's arts and culture sector by providing services to members and clients across the country. Our membership adheres to a professional code of conduct, and our programs include professional development activities such as these: mentorship, podcasts, and networking, online and in person. Thank you to Canadian Heritage for supporting this series, the members of our program committee, Maurizio and Jennifer, and all of you who chose to submit questions in advance. Thank you. We will be using Q&A, not the chat, for Zoom protocol, and we are recording for later availability on the website, and we are providing captioning for those who wish it, which you can find on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You will also find the captioning button on the toolbar. And to introduce the panel, I will pass you over to our board chair, Victoria Steele.
Thank you, Sue. I'm zooming in from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, where I have the privilege to live and work. I've recorded this introduction to our panel today, as I will be joining former colleagues at the National Arts Centre at the time of this webinar to honor the passing of our former leader, Peter Herndorf. And one of our panelists today will also share some special remarks about Peter. When we looked at the topic of decolonizing practice, it appeared to be an overwhelming and daunting task. There's no one-size-fits-all method, and the mere idea of how this fits within the world of consulting is somewhat intimidating. Decolonization is a challenging, reflective process of learning and unlearning. How can we avoid failure and recolonization during this journey of decolonizing the practice? To begin the conversation on this topic, we reached out to Denise Bolduc, who will moderate the discussion today. She is an established creator, director, and creative producer who programs to transform perspectives and activate change. Her career represents countless contributions and connections with numerous artists, thinkers, and institutions, nationally and internationally. Denise has led small to large-scale multidisciplinary arts programs, is a filmmaker, writer, host, mentor, educator, advisor, and member of numerous boards and committees. Denise is Anishinaabe and French, born and raised in the Lake Superior Robinson Huron Treaty Territory, and is a member of the Batchewana First Nation with familial ties in Garton River First Nation. Together, we quickly identified two gifted, creative individuals to offer their thoughts, experiences, and considerations to look at navigating this process of decolonization. Jani Lauzon is a multidisciplinary artist of Métis, French, Finnish ancestry. She is a 9-time Dora Mavor-Mora-nominated actress, 3-time Juno-nominated singer-songwriter, and a Gemini Award-winning puppeteer, an award-winning director, and an artist educator. Her company, Paper Canoe Project, supports productions of her own work, including Prophecy Frog, which is currently on tour. I'm a big fan and delighted that she could join us today. And I've had the pleasure of knowing our next panelist for many years. Sarah Garton Stanley self-describes as theater director, dramaturg, conversationalist, PhD candidate, changemaker, and thinker. Sarah is currently artistic producer of the National Creation Fund at the National Arts Center, where she works to initiate new projects across the country and is based out of beautiful rural Nova Scotia. I so look forward to this conversation and pass it over to our moderator, Denise Bolduc.
Bonjour. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here. As Victoria mentioned in her video, and to honor and offer a special honoring of a wonderful human and what we in the Indigenous country call a visionary trailblazer, Peter Herndorf. We would like to take this moment to offer a small tribute to Peter. So I'd like to pass this over to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Denise, for the opportunity, and to Victoria for making it possible just to take a moment to mark the passing of Peter Herndorf. Peter came to Canada as a boy of 7. He grew up in Winnipeg and eventually made Toronto his home. He was the publisher of Toronto Life, vice president of English services at the CBC, chairman and CEO of TV Ontario, and until 2018, the president and CEO of the National Arts Centre. During his time at the NAC, amid countless accomplishments, was the establishment of the Indigenous Theatre Company and the hiring of Kevin Loring as its first artistic director, something for which Peter was tremendously proud. Peter died this past Saturday, February 18th, and leaves a tremendous imprint on this land and its people and on me. I had the distinct privilege of working with him for close to 10 years, and I've always felt lucky for this. Of all his gifts, the one I felt he most possessed was to make people feel seen. How rare, how wonderful, how transformative. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Truly, Peter was a remarkable human. Before we begin, I would first like to acknowledge Victoria and Jewel from the ACCA. We have been in contact, as Victoria mentioned in her video, since really last September. And I would like to acknowledge their commitment and openness and their willingness to keep moving forward with this conversation, including supporting the work in process. Because I made them work to get here for this webinar, and supporting my description and to move forward toward change and respectfully working together. I would also like to acknowledge Sue for jumping in today, and Maurizio for his expert digital support. So I'd like to start first with a quote. From our very first breath, we are in relationship. With that indrawn draft of air, we become joined to everything that ever was, is, and ever will be. When we exhale, we forget that relationship by virtue of the act of living. Our breath commingles with all breath, and we are a part of everything. That's the simple fact of things. We are born into a state of relationship, and our ceremonies and rituals are guided to lead us deeper into that relationship with all things. Big lesson: relationships never end, and they just change. In believing that lies the freedom to carry compassion, empathy, love, kindness, and respect into and through whatever changes. We are made more by that practice. This quote is by Richard Wagamese, one of the country's most celebrated First Nations authors and storytellers. Richard is an Ojibwe, or was an Ojibwe Anishinaabe, who passed away in 2017. But his words are his legacy. This quote is from his book, Embers, One Ojibwe's Meditation. And I highly recommend everyone get it, because you can go through it and read quotes, read little bits of stories. And it was so challenging to find the right quote to kick off our conversation today. And that one, I just kept coming back to, because it's all about relationships, right? So I'm very grateful to be sharing this space with these two incredible humans, Jani and Sarah. I'm a huge fan of each of you, and it truly is a gift that each of you found time in your very busy schedules to be here and to share your thoughts on such a very complex and layered topic. So thank you. So let's just kick in here. You both bring a wealth of experience and wisdom as trailblazers in the creative world. So my first question is, how do you believe relationships have been affected by colonial narratives, systems, and structures? And what does decolonization mean to you? Or what is your understanding of the process of decolonization to include? Big kickoff questions.
Yeah, say that that's the whole hour and a half conversation, right? Yeah, do you want to jump in, Sarah, or would you like me to start?
Yeah. Why don't you start? If you're ready with something, and hopefully we can have a good back and forth on it.
You bet, absolutely. Can you repeat the first part of that question, Denise? Just
Absolutely. Do you want me to start with you both bring a wealth of
no, you can skip that part.
Experiences?
Here.
How do you believe relationships have been affected by colonial narratives, systems, and structures?
Great. I'm going to digress. I remember reading something in Science magazine years and years ago about, there was a study that had been done, and it had used a high school football team to do this study, and unbeknownst to the players on the high school football team, certain attitudes were brought forward to different players, and one player was constantly encouraged and told that they were fantastic. And I'm using this as a paraphrasing, because it was a long time ago when I read this, and one player was constantly told that they were not doing very well, and that they were failing, and that they weren't doing well. And that player ended up having to quit the team and got quite unhealthy. And then the experiment fell apart, of course, because what they realized was that they were actually really harming this young man. And to me, that's really the relationship is about an assumption of superiority that came with, that is the basis to me of colonial thinking. I am better than you, you are less than I am. And so therefore that is the basis of our relationship. And that, repeated enough times, makes you unwell. And also creates a dynamic in the relationship that is really, really difficult to navigate and to maneuver. And so, the constant repetition and repetition and repetition of these ideals and ideas that I am better than you has had such a devastating effect to the equality of what could have been a beautiful, amazing relationship. And that's in so many ways started out that way, as we know, when the Europeans first arrived, they were well taken care of by the Indigenous nations who fed them, showed them how to survive, showed them how to hunt, showed them where the medicines were, showed them where to get the water, showed them, that was the beginning of the offer that was given. And what that's developed into is what is oftentimes what I call an unconscious bias. So now it's been so ingrained in the consciousness. It's been so ingrained in the way that our relationship works with each other that there is an unconscious bias on both sides. There are so many. We struggle so much in the Indigenous community because of what we've bought into in terms of how we see ourselves in the world, and also others have bought into it, and it's become so ingrained in just the way of thinking that they don't even realize that they have a conscious bias, which makes it an unconscious bias. But it's detrimental to how we've been able to move forward, and the thing I think that brings us into this idea of decolonization. So I know that, so I don't use that word decolonization. For me personally, because it implies still that there's a hierarchical system, which there is, but it also still implies that. And I would rather go into the conversation not having that assumption that I'm pushing against something that still has more power than I do. The other thing that I would be a hypocrite to say that there aren't things about the system that I like. For example, in the world of theater, I really like working with lights and sound and things that have been developed through a colonial process in a way, or borrowed from another system that we wouldn't necessarily have used in our storytelling practices. So I tend to look at what is it, and I ask myself, what is it about the system that I would like to keep? Which means that I would be hypocritical to say that I want to tear the whole thing down, because I actually don't want to tear the whole thing down. I want to look at the things that work for me, the things that I like. I want to be honest with myself to say, as an artist, these are things that I really enjoy. And I also, having been an activist and an advocate for so long, I've also realized that coming in with that attitude of trying to, and I understand why, I totally understand. And I should preface all of this to say that I'm just speaking for myself. I don't represent the broader spectrum of how all Indigenous people think, because it's not the way we work. But that I like to look at, instead of tearing something down, what can I fill it up with? Which is a different kind of intention, and it's a different kind of energy. And as an actor, I'm always working with the idea of intention. So as opposed to tearing something down, I want to try to see what I can fill it up with, which is a different kind of process, or a different kind of way of contextualizing the dialogue around the action of what it is that we're trying to achieve. Maybe I'll stop there, and then because we can circle back to all of these things, and throw it over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Jani. So much to pick up on. I hadn't thought about this book until you were speaking about, loving lights and sound and stuff. And it makes me think of Hospicing Modernity, which is written by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira. So it's a recommendation for folks to read, because it really struggles with this question.
Mm.
And it's about how we've all grown up in this affect of modernity, or through these colonial processes, and what it really means to live through to the other side of them. And I find it to be a very powerful read, and something that has really offered me some other ways to think about this question. And yeah, when you opened a couple of things, I'm so glad you said that you don't use the word decolonization, because it really brings me back to Jani and I worked together at the very beginning of the first cycle that we did at the NAC, looking at the Indigenous body of work. And the reason it's actually called the Indigenous body of work, other people may have referred to it, but it was because Jani Lauzon said, I don't want to use the word canon. Why don't we call it the Indigenous body of work? And so that immediately became adopted in a broader sense. And similarly, when we came to that sort of first gathering, we knew that canon was actually not a good word to use, but it was there to kind of offer something to kind of reflect or react or respond to. And what an amazing opening that offered in terms of a whole different space. So hearing you speak, Jani, about, like the intention to fill rather than to empty, in a sense, is pretty beautiful to consider. I think the first thing that I think about with that question about let's call it the damages that colonization has done to relationships. And, I think of colonization as kind of the greatest story that until very recently was untold, in that, of course, we all grew up in it, but it was never revealed to be just the story that it was. Just that thing that the person said to that football player, just that way in which power dynamics sat with it, was just that thing. It was, and to finally sort of go, no, it's not just that thing. It was a set of decisions that were powerfully imprinted over and over, to the point where it became this, hidden or unconscious set of ways of being and ways of doing that feel impossible to move against or to think differently about. And so I think a lot about that with respect to the land and knowledge that comes from the land, and people who have lived and grown up from the land, of which I'm not. Like, I grew up in Montreal, Tiohtià:ke, like that's where I am today. But I grew up, when I went to the country, it was to, the manicured country, where there was the country house and there was the green, and, so to sort of understand the land as a teacher, and everything that surrounds us as teachings, to me, sits within Indigenous ways of knowing. And it's not to say that all Indigenous people are plugged in or whatever. And of course, that's part of the, a larger kind of issue. But because actually so many, sadly, Indigenous folks grow up in the city and can't get to the, to the land. But that aside, I think the relationship dominion over, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, I was raised through the teachings that I had dominion over the land, the animals. I eat, I don't think about the damages, the ravages, the costs. I don't think about, I'd like to think that I do think about it now, but certainly growing up, it was clear that was ours as human beings, our position, and the big hour. And then within the relations, as you say, Jani, like, history shows, stories tell us that, when we as settlers came to this land, we were really well provided for, but we did what has been done historically throughout history, made a determination that a certain set of ways were better than another set of ways. And as a result of that power dynamic we're still in it. We're still trying to work through that, I think I'll pass it over to you.
Do you have any response, Jani? Went this morning and last evening reading through Richard's words in his book. It's all about the wider relationship. And, it goes to all my relations. And And that teaching, right? Because all my relations is not just our human ancestors, it's all of our relationship to what you were speaking to, Sarah, about the land, the rocks, the trees, the birds, all of that are relations. And, it's true. I, agree. We've all been taught to have control over all of that, which is, look at what's happening in the world, cyclones, earthquakes, flooding, weather shifts. Like there's hardly any snow here in Toronto and it's February. Like there's so many connections there to what you spoke about and how we need to change our ways of being, our philosophies as human beings.
It makes me it makes me giggle sometimes, which is, sometimes the only thing that you can do. In that, the human species. There's a great little short film called 3 Seconds, and it's all about, human existence on this earth, and in the entire history of this earth and its existence, human beings have really only been here for 3 seconds. and the fact that we've come with these, they're pompous ideas, right? They're just ridiculously pompous ideas that we know more than the earth does is so, like I said, you kind of just have to giggle because it's so pompous, it's so ridiculous, but it is the basis of, like you're saying, Sarah, like it is the basis of colonial thinking, that assumption of superiority, not only on top of another human race, but also the land itself, the animals, the water, just the amazing, the amazing capabilities of water to hold memory and to be affected. Also, water is also affected, and when you talk to some of the elders, they talk about how before you drink your glass of water, say thanks to it and tell it that you love it, because then it will feed your body in a different kind of way. Like, that those things aren't important is what has got us. Those ideas are what has gotten us to also the situation that we're in today. But I think, we're finally starting to clue into the fact that we better start re-energizing our relationship with the earth, or we simply won't survive as a human species. That is the truth of it, right? So, but I would highly recommend people watching that little short film. I think it's on YouTube, but I'm not quite sure. Actually, I shouldn't speak about that. But we have to shift consciousness. We have to do it. We have to shift. We're at a time and a place now where we have to shift our consciousness. We have to, and we have to make different choices for many, 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 many reasons.
So I'm with you, Jani, when Victoria first asked me to do a workshop or a conversation on decolonization, I was like, oh God, not that. Really? So boring and old fashioned, but it's so at the forefront for so many, right? And I struggle with it. And I love your suggestions and thinking around changing and shifting that thinking of what that is. But I also need to ask you some questions around that too, right?
Like, absolutely. Yes.
Because colonization, we could just talk about colonization and the uncomfortableness of it, and how that uncomfortableness of colonization may have affected yourselves in your work, or you've witnessed how it's affected or impacted others. And a lot of that is in relationship to power and authority, for sure. But there's some also systemic, deeply rooted, colonial structures within the industry, and that are really hard to break through. And I don't know if either of you have any comments about our experiences you would like to share around that.
Absolutely. So I have sort of a two-tier approach to that, too, because they're related, but they're slightly different experiences. So, my foster father was a huge Shakespeare fan, and that's a controversial issue around the in the Indigenous community right now in terms of why are we still celebrating the dead white guy? But I just love his work. I think he's such a fantastic freaking poet, right? And, then I've had arguments with people about, well, he wasn't really a real person and he didn't really write his plays. And I'm like, I don't care. Like, whoever Shakespeare was, the work is just really fantastic. And I found, because I taught at the Center for Indigenous Theatre, and I was trying to find ways to not only engage myself, but also my students. I was trying to find ways that I could get into that world and to find intersections that would really engage my Indigenous students. But I found, when I came to Toronto in the 1980s, I found that I had wanted to study Shakespeare, and I went to I won't name names, but I went to a very accomplished Shakespeare workshop class, and my teacher said, well, you can take the class, but you'd be wasting your money because you'll never work in Shakespeare. The color of your skin will be detrimental to you. You're not what people are looking for. And so I took the class anyway, because I'm the kind of person that is spurned on by that kind of fire. And then I spend my entire life trying to prove people wrong, which is probably why it's done so well. But anyway, you use what you have. But those kinds of sentiments are only now starting to break apart. Like, just within the last 5 years, really, those sentiments are starting to finally really, really, those cinder block walls are starting to fall. And so I'm really excited about where we'll be in 10 years. I also want to acknowledge the fact that this kind of work has been going on for the last century. There were Indigenous people at the turn of the century that also wanted to do Shakespeare. They were also in the same situation that I was in, that really, really pushed hard to try to break down those cinder walls. And I got further than they did, and the youth following me will get further than I did. So we've been chipping away at this wall for a very long time. There's been a lot of artists way before I was even born who were trying to speak to inclusivity, to diversity, to decolonizing. This practice of wanting to be included has been going on for a long, long time. There are many, 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 many artists before me. So I feel that it's really important that we contextualize this. This is not just from yesterday or 5 years ago. We are able to do what we're doing because of the people who have been fighting before us. So the way that I dealt with that in my career was that I just created my own work, or I went to companies that were more like-minded. And they tended to be the smaller independent companies that would take an offer and a chance for me to play Mark Antony, to play Shylock, to play Lady Capulet and Peter, I love Peter. I love all the clowns. And to, be able to do the All Indigenous project of King Lear at the NAC, because it took somebody like Peter Hinton to go, this is important. So it's all of those people who worked so hard to push against that brick wall, that cinder block wall, that, to bang on it and say, we want in, we want to be invited to the table. Or in my case, just to create your own work, because that was that was the thing that allowed me to be the artist that I was, or to diversify my practice. So I feel that's the artistic world. Peter was way ahead of his time in terms of the way that he was thinking. And of course, Peter Herndorf at NAC understood the importance of that way before anybody else did. And so we're having these breakthroughs now because of the seeds that have been planted quite a long time ago. I would say that the more difficult aspect for me around this issue is being invited into organizations as in a more administrative or consultant position. And I know you know this really well, Denise, where even the very idea, again, language, I'm invited onto organizations that want an anti-racism committee. And I'm like, great. So can we just reframe the conversation and say, let's call it an inclusive committee or an inclusion committee or something again because oftentimes what happens is we contextualize this conversation with it's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, and it's going to be a fight. And anti-racism, it creates that kind of intention or energy in the body. What I've found most oftentimes, in the last 20 years that I've been doing this kind of work is that I'm invited into the organization and that my very presence is what the organization assumes will will represent decolonization, will represent just that it's happening. And what I keep trying to say to folks is, you can hire Indigenous people, but that's not the work. That's not the work. That is not decolonizing. The work is much deeper, much broader, much more interesting, and much more possible of something really fantastic to happen. And the other reason why I don't like the idea of decolonization, because what I find that what happens then is it creates this fear, and the conversations are around having to put down or let go of something in order to make space for us. And while I do agree that that is true, there is such resistance to letting go or making space as a concept that I think is the thing that holds us back from actually making this a lot easier. And what I mean by that is if, again, we assume that we have to do something what is appeared to be negative in order to do something inclusive, that act and intention and understanding of how hard it's going to be to let this aspect go or let something go is the thing that creates the tension, is the thing that makes this conversation so difficult to have. Because I'm coming willingly to the table to say, here's how I think you can make change. What I often find is that there's such a resistance on the other side because of this fear of what it means to actually let something go. So what I'm trying to do is shift, again, the narrative. I'm trying to shift the conversation, and why, again, I'm not talking about tearing something down or throwing something aside, or what I'm trying to say is, what can we fill it up with? What can we fill it up with? And if you take a glass of water and you put more water into it, then the things that don't need to be there spill out of the top. If you go in with this attitude that I have to make a sacrifice by taking a cup out of this glass of water so that you can add something, then it's all based on this idea of sacrifice or fear. And again, the relationship then creates this, I am making a sacrifice in order for you to come into this conversation. And I'm just really tired of that. I don't want to have to be in those kind of conversations anymore. I don't want to have to say, oh, thank you so much for making the sacrifice. Like I'm just trying to be honest with everybody here now, because it's just where we're at right now. And I've been doing this for so long that I'm like, yeah, I'm not interested anymore in that conversation. Anyway.
No, I just want to push back a little bit on that. Just to say that I think change is change, and change is hard.
Yeah.
And I think it should be, actually, for those who have not had to consider certain not just inequalities, but certain ways of being and doing that in no way are responsive to a different glass of water.
Right.
And so I hear you so loud and clear around the sacrifice model. Totally. It's just like, oh, look what I had to give up to have this, like, yeah, like what a waste of everybody's time and energy. And what an insult, actually, to anyone who's sort of invited to that kind of conversation, which happens a lot. But to, literally be like, when you say it's not the work to hire Indigenous people to come into institutions, that's not the work. That's not Indigenous work. That's kind of the institutional's work of hiring people in. True, but it also means that the work can then begin to happen, so long as there are people within the organization who are working to make those changes.
Yeah, and that's what I meant. Like, you can't just hire somebody and say that's exactly. We've done it now.
No,
that's what I meant. Yeah.
No, I totally got that. And I think that's what happens a lot, is like somebody gets, brought in. It's like, oh, phew, we have our person, and of course, standard bearer and on the website, like all those sorts of things. It's like, okay, good, we're good. So we're, that is a constant thing. And, you kept referring to the cinder blocks. And it's just before we started, I was talking about the opening of Tina Bausch. If no one's seen it, it's an incredible effect. And there's this big cinder block wall. That's all I'll say. So that's where the cinder blocks are coming from. But institutions, many of the institutions that we're talking about have a lot of cinder blocks in their walls, really, truly do. And so,
a lot of bricks.
A lot of bricks. Exactly.
Which is harder than those to get through that cinder block.
Or limestone if you're in Kingston. Yeah.
Yes. Even harder. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah. And, like who wants to, particularly as artists, who wants to put their energy into bashing through those walls?
Yeah.
And I guess I've always felt that my role as a settler and as somebody who believes in change, not for the sake of change, but believes that the stories that we have been told and that we've been telling are not as beautiful or as vast or as wide or as incredible as they could be, are not as innovative as they could be. My role as a settler is to take out the sledgehammer. Like, that's actually my role. Mm-hmm. And I think often what happens is that that role is placed at your feet, Jani, if you're brought into the institution, or Denise, if you're brought in. It's sort of like, well, let's see what they do. Like, what's, and I think, of course, that's very uncomfortable. Of course, I feel like I should never say half the things I say. And I often feel like I put myself out there in a way that is not, that I don't know if I know how to kind of stand up to what I've said. But if I don't, then who's going to, right? And I do think it's the settler's job within the institutions to be the person who figures out how to take out that brick wall or that limestone wall.
Well, it's the labor, right? It's
labor. Yeah.
It's where you place labor. Like, you don't bring in an Indigenous person and expect them to speak to everything and to solve all the problems, right? Are the issues, are the challenges, are, like something as simple as Jani going back. I was thinking about the turtle gals and smudging, and how that became such a huge issue in spaces, right? Yeah. And I mean, change has happened around that hugely for understanding the importance of that and respecting the importance of that. However, it's still a struggle, in spaces. So that labor, that is a huge thing. And then, labor, like, I have been asked things about how to greet people in language. Like, what? Like, that's not why I'm here. I'm not here to do that. and in different nations. Like
Mhm.
we're very diverse. We're very complex. We're very layered, just like every other human out there. It's just, yeah.
I think
It's
the interesting thing for me in terms of what you're saying, Denise, is what I've discovered is that a lot of the organizations I work with, and organizations are a group of people who are making decisions. How do I want to contextualize this story? I started and then I'm like, maybe I should say that differently.
Giggle.
What they really want is non-threatening Indigenous content.
Yeah.
Right. So they want to hear from you. They want your opinion, but they don't want it to actually threaten the way that things already work. The status quo that they know that already works. They don't want it to affect funding bottom lines. And so it's, they want non-threatening sort of, or what is perceived as non-threatening. And so that's, one thing that I've experienced in terms of, I often start now my conversations when I'm working with organizations and I'm working with people to say, I just want to remind you that this is actually what you've hired me to do. So what I'm prefacing this with, what I'm about to say, I'm just reminding you that this is why you brought me on, was because you wanted me to accomplish this. And so now I'm going to say the thing that you hired me to do. Because if I don't contextualize it sometimes, then I say the thing and they go, oh, well, And so I have to remind them that this was what they wanted from me. Because if I don't, then sometimes the things that I'm saying are perceived in a way where they're threatening versus non-threatening. The other thing that is true for sure is that there are many great reasons why there are a lot of Indigenous people that don't trust what my friend Jani calls a PWI, predominantly white institution. There's many reasons why that trust obviously has been broken. And so the other thing that I know I have to constantly reiterate is that there's two ways of looking at it's going to be hard or it's just going to take time. It's just going to take some time. And what I'm finding is that because organizations and because people want this conversation to move quickly so that we can just get over it, so that we can get to the other side. And like, it's not going to happen that way. Does that make it hard? Yes, it does. But you can look at it a different way. You can say, instead of looking at it going, well, that's really going to be hard. You could just say, you know what? It's just going to take some time. It's just going to take some time, because you have to understand that rebuilding trust is the first fundamental step of the work. Right? That is the first fundamental thing that we should be trying to achieve before programs, before blah, 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 before anything else, is just reestablishing what you said first off, Denise, relationship. It's going to take some time to redevelop that relationship. And that is really about trust. And that, again, in terms of, organizations, I say I can introduce you to some people, but I can't make that relationship happen. That is, you have to do that. You have to make those steps. I'll give you a phone number. I'll give you an email address. You have to make that happen. You have to reach out. You have to develop that relationship, because I can't do that for you. I can make connections for you, but I can't do it. I can't do it on your behalf. I can't do it for you. And I always go short-term goals, long-term goals. Short-term goals are really about reestablishing relationship. Long-term goals are then, once the relationship is established, we can actually get some work done, and it'll happen organically anyway. But we're not a threat. We're not a threat. We weren't a threat when the colonizers arrived here in the first place. We weren't a threat. We were welcoming. we became a threat because the idea came from them that we were, right?
So I often use this concept of, I know it's really hard to learn all this stuff and it's challenging, but we've been learning all of these colonial systems forever. So now it's time to shift and relook at things just differently, right? It is a bit of dismantling each of us. Like every day I go, wow, did I learn that? How do I unlearn that? How do I unlearn these feelings, right? And in relationships, what does responsibility and accountability mean to you in a professional relationship? Like how does that relate?
Yeah, let me jump in for a second. Just say so many things. Oh boy, I think the work of relationship is never done, and I think it's a colonial hangover that it's like, oh, we'll just get this fixed, and then we'll be able to. Like, I think relationships are hard. Like they're just hard, even like when they come full of like real good reasons for there to be trust almost off the top. They're still hard, And Jani, when you were talking about, I love that, short-term, long-term, it reminds me of the meme of, like you'll never get as much done in a day as you think you can, but you'll get more done in 3 months than you thought you could. And there's something about that when you speak to that makes me think, yeah, it's just, so long as our intentions are like, we keep moving forward towards, a deeper relationship, a deeper understanding of one another, whoever the one another is. And then when you say, we're not a threat, I'm quoting you, I think that there's lots of good reasons why certain people are and wish to damage I can't remember what your acronym was for the mainly white mainly white
PWIs, predominantly white institutions.
Predominantly white.
That Riani Azi's
yeah. And there's lots of reasons, I think, why there would be certain people who really do wish to, tear them, dismantle, cause damage for really good reasons, I think, and I think also that settlers across the board and probably everybody has certain fears that they wish they didn't have. We wish that we were better. We wish that we were more advanced. We wish that we were less racist. We wish that we were less, homophobic. We wish that we were, less snobby, like all those things. And so when it comes to those phone calls you're talking about, like, I agree. That's the first step. It's just like, you may have all these fears. You may have all these worries that you're going to do shit wrong. Excuse me for swearing. But actually you just have to, that's the work. It's like picking up the phone or saying, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to say hello to you. I'm sorry, whatever, but it's stepping into the ring. And I guess maybe that is my own colonized mindset, but I do feel that it is a bit of a ring. Like it doesn't mean that someone has to be knocked out. It does mean though that there's a wrestle and there's so much history riding for everybody on both sides. If it's a dialogue, that I think that those things need to be somehow allowed into the space for good long-term relationships to develop and to grow. Yeah.
I just want to add something too, if I may, Denise.
Sure.
I think because I've had lots of conversations with folks who are from different cultural backgrounds, and I think even the term settler is very specific. So when we're looking at building relationships, I just want to point out that not everybody considers themselves a settler here. There's communities, Black communities who came here through slavery. There's Chinese people who came through another form of slavery. There's lots of different reasons why people have arrived, and so I think even this conversation is about settler and colonial thinking, but you can also come with aspects of colonial thinking, even if you've come here as a non-settler, right? So, or the importance of building relationships with all communities, settler or non-settler, who have come to this land from and because of a variety of different reasons. But the core fundamental importance is building relationship and figuring out how to move forward together. Yeah. I felt compelled to say that.
And often many of the people who do come here come from places that have been colonized.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is, you know, I mean, we have to think about that. There's a question in relationship. How do we deal with the generalizations and champion the examples of success in this area? This person is wondering if the percentages of good working relations built on trust have been increasing, or are we stuck? And what will move things forward over the time it's going to take? Yeah, I mean, I can, speak to stuff, but I'm going to give this to the two of you to respond to.
I mean, I think one thing that we sort of danced around is Michael Grey Eyes, when he was involved early on in the cycle as well. And his big question was like, well, what's the knowledge mobilization about this going to be? Like, how are we going to get this information out? Who are we going to tell? How is it going to, spread? And, Michael Grey Eyes is now movie star Michael Grey Eyes, but at that time he was PhD, Dr. Grey Eyes, head of something at York University. And previously he was a ballet dancer who decided he would never dance ballet again because of the colonial, in his terminology, ways in which it made his body move that were not how his body wanted to move in the world. And so I raised that because he is a great role model and example of an individual who has taken on a lot of different institutions and continued kind of through them to share different possibilities for a wide range of people following in his footsteps. And I just say that Jani Lauzon similarly is doing that in a very major way in the Canadian performing arts world, in terms of the spaces and places that you've touched, Jani, and the stages that you've been on, like and the ways in which you've communicated. I mean, those are just kind of two examples where to this question, while these are not kind of institutionally specific, I'm a really big believer in, if you can see yourself, there's a really great possibility that you will then have more choices to choose going forward in the world. And so when Jani said, like, in 20 years there'll be more people who will be able to be more successful or whatever than you were, Jani, I think it's because of the work that you've done. And to me, that's a grand positive in the midst of a lot of things that aren't maybe yet as positive.
Absolutely. I have to, yeah. Well, to be really honest with you, I never thought that we would get even this far in my lifetime. I'm embarrassed to say that in a way, because just because of how long people have been chipping away at this. But there were so many things, obviously, in the last, several years that have, I liken it to the image of a pot of boiling water that has a lid on it, and it's like a pressure cooker. And so for the last 100 years, it's more than that, but the last 100 years especially, it's been like, and finally, with the death of several Indigenous young women in this country, that was accumulative from all of the other deaths that had happened before that, the accumulation of George Floyd. There was a number of things that just blew that lid off the pressure cooker that all culminated in the years and years and years and years of work that had come before that created the pot of boiling water in the first place, that have allowed us to move forward faster than I ever anticipated that we would be able to move forward. So I have to say that on one level, I'm absolutely thrilled. There are programs with the Indigenous Screen Office right now for Indigenous filmmakers that I could never have imagined would be possible 10 years ago. There are opportunities at the Stratford Festival that I never could have imagined before. There's the work that Peter did with Kevin at the NAC now that 10, 15 years ago, we couldn't have imagined would actually happen. So I have great faith in the fact that that lid is blown off, and where it goes is going to be really exciting. I want to counter that though with the fact that, I've spoken with a lot of people who are on the ground, the ground level, working in Indigenous communities, trying to bring artistic practice and healing to our youth. And I can say that the majority of people that I've talked to have said that we got far and we've now reverted back because of COVID. The isolation that our youth, especially in our communities, has had experienced during COVID has been devastating to their well-being, their mental health, their ability to move forward, to make decisions. So while we are moving forward in a great way, we are still dealing with a crisis on inside the communities. And like Michelle Thrush, Penny Cucci, Sid Bob, I've been talking to leaders in our industry that have identified that they have identified that this is an issue. There is a crisis need for support systems on the reserves to make sure that our youth are going to make it through the next little bit. And the devastating effects that COVID had on the isolation of just the general public was huge. But in our communities, it was even deeper and more difficult. And so I'm concerned, I'm worried, but at the same time, I'm really, really hopeful that there are more opportunities for my daughter now than there ever has been for Indigenous people to train, to connect with programs, to make films, to write plays, that's the thing that makes me hopeful. It also makes me hopeful that when I look at my daughter and her group of friends and her group of young Indigenous folks that she connects with, how hard they are working to make sure that the work that has been done prior to their ability to move forward in the places that they are moving forward, that they're really working hard to maintain and grow what has been created, and to we're all at a bit of a loss in terms of how to really support youth right in the community, but I know that there's a lot of hope with the youth that we do have in the future.
I think there's been some significant paradigm shifts too with respect to well, we could start with, Jessie Wente is the chair of the board of the Canada Council. That's one. But the other is with respect to philanthropy, that Indigenous artists and culture makers are starting to say, to check in and say, well, I'm not sure if we want your money if it's not actually intended to be part of a building of a world that is important to us and our youth and to our needs. And I think that to me is a positive, but I do think, Jani, that there's, as with everywhere, and this is this or it is a colonial hangover. There's classism within all of this, and there is, there are certain working artists and Indigenous folk who are way more resourced than other people. And I think that also gets conflated sometimes and forgotten about. And it's part of the larger issue, I think, that is tied to colonization and this fear of what you'll give up. Like, if you give up this, what's it going to mean? And how do we rethink about community? Because when you raise that very real situation with respect to COVID, it opens up a floodgate of all of the ways in which Indigenous youth are not being considered in a much larger Canadian political landscape. When we talk about and water, like, there's just so many ways. And so I go from like the heights of, look who's heading the Canada Council, and then I think of, like, it's just, yeah. So there are successes. To the question of the person who asked, I think, yes, we should celebrate the successes. But as to what Jani brought up, I think it's super important that we continue to really look at the realities of what is being unearthed and discovered, sadly, on a weekly basis, with respect to the horrors of this country and the formations of this country through past practices and, to a degree, present practices. Yeah.
Like a little bit of an aside, but even the fact that, CBC came forward with that announcement that they were looking to put all of their, they're not going to be a regular broadcaster anymore and everything's going to go online, like that completely wipes out a whole pile of people in the North and in Indigenous communities who, half of the Indigenous communities are still on broadband. They have no high speed Wi-Fi. Like, it's just ludicrous that our national institutions are even considering this, because, again, to me, it comes down to consideration. So what I love about some of my colleagues at the National Theatre School now is that, we've been working there enough now and bringing this conversation forward now that people are starting to go, oh, I should have included this or you in this conversation I had. And I was like, yeah, you should have. So it's again, it comes down to unconscious bias, like allowing that to go away and going consciously, how are you being, even on an individual level, how are you being inclusive in the way that you're looking at things as an individual? Have you thought about this, the way that you practice? Have you thought about how it will affect Indigenous people specifically, or Indigenous youth? Or do you have this, that's creating space for how you're moving forward with your thoughts about building practice, about building organization? Are you considering that if you go digital, then you're going to cut off a certain amount of Indigenous folks who live, north of a certain amount of parallel, because they just don't even have access to some are still running on generators, and it's like it's up to ourselves as individuals to be conscious of what our decisions, what kind of impact our decisions have, and what do they make, not just for us, but for all, right?
Yeah, the CBC is one of the only, radio, they're 99 point whatever that can be received in the North. Like, there's very few stations, and except for maybe a local radio, because there was a project years ago that created these little radio hubs in communities. So I don't even know why CBC is even considering that, when there's been all kinds of promises about making sure the networks are stronger in the North and access, and couple things. One, there's actually a really beautiful positive story coming out of Nabinamek, which is summer beaver, and it's a flying community in northwestern Ontario. And it's a story of, I guess, this teacher who really wants to bring his students to Toronto to see how there's other opportunities, in particular in the arts.
Wow.
So he's bringing them to the ROM, he's bringing them to likely the AGO. I can't remember the other places, but he had a whole campaign fundraising, and it's still one of those, I forget what they're called, online fundraisers. And it's really, really I was so moved by it. And now I'm keep sending notes to people. We need to host them. We need to do stuff, because it's really exciting that he's trying to encourage positivity. So when those types of visits happen, or even if you're not in an urban center, community is so connecting to Indigenous communities. Almost every urban center has one right beside it.
Wow.
And to connect with those Indigenous communities is so important, and not in a frivolous transactional way. Like, invite them to your space, do tours, have conversations, connect them to the Indigenous programming if you're doing that in your spaces, and other artists, because that will make them feel seen and important. So that was one thing I wanted to add. And then a comment that someone offered.
Could I just jump in? Sorry,
Sure.
I just wanted to jump in because I think where certainly Jani and I met for a period in our history was around the Indigenous body of work. And I just think one of the most powerful success stories has been the centering of Indigenous stories on this land, in this country, in all cultural representations. We can look at it through the superstars like, Kent Monkman. We can look at it through Chief Lady Bird. We can
Lady Bird, yeah.
Thompson Highway. We can look at it like we can look at it through the new writers coming up. We can look at it like there's such a breadth in filmmaking, in music, in dance. Like it's that shift, I think, must be celebrated and must be,
yes,
according to me, supported, because that's the beginning for me. When I think about relationship and collaboration, that's the starting point for how I, as a person who does come from settler heritage, can really begin to share in storytelling, because then it's about my experience here and the experience of those who were here before, offering me a seat at their table or on their, whatever. And I think it's something that, while we're still early, it's going to be so fantastic so long as we continue to see it as the success that it is and continue to celebrate it.
Thank you. That's a beautiful addition to this. I want to open it up for people to continue to adding questions or comments in the Q&A. And comment is, as a person of color, I found the settler, non-settler binary awkward, but have resolved that since my immigrating ancestors' aspiration was to oppress or maintain colonial structures, I've come to terms with self-describing, and in brackets, in a binary way, as a settler. Just interesting. Thank you for that comment. Where am I? Okay. Do you have any thoughts or further suggestions on being radical, action-oriented within the process of change? I mean, and also ensuring that recolonization doesn't happen during the change, because that's also something that is happening out there.
I don't know why it makes me think of this, but I remember it was the late 1980s. You might have even been there, Denise, when we had gatherings at Native Earth, and Maria Campbell was there. Oh yeah, and it was connected to the Canada Council too, because at that time they were trying to figure out what this idea of Indigenous theater was, right? And I remember one of the questions from Canada Council was like, could you guys come up with a definition as to what Indigenous theater is? And I remember Maria Campbell going like, well, why would we want to do that? Because once you define something, so what she was saying is once you define something like that, then all of our generations that are past are then, put into that little box of the definition that we've created. And so I like to look at the idea of storytelling as an Indigenous work as an incredibly open, fluid thing in terms of it's really about what the artist would like to come forward and bring. So I don't want to define what it is, because I think that it sets our youth up and the generations to follow in a very awkward kind of way. But I do really love what you said, Sarah, about really celebrating the artists. I mean, I would say that the best way to really, besides reading Richard's books and a lot of really other amazing books that are out there, is watching those films, watching the series, but going to see live theater as well, and going to events as much as possible where elders speak, or the storytelling that is coming through our artists right now every artist is addressing these issues that we're dealing with in a really beautiful and artistic way. And there's just some really incredible work that is not starting to happen. It's been happening since forever, but it's more accessible now. And I think making a commitment, as Sarah was saying, to really supporting these artists by going to see their work is going to be super informative. Because of the content and what we're talking about in the stories that we're sharing.
Sarah, do you have any comments?
I do. I wanted to just respond to the person who talked about the binary of settler. Just because when I was looking up to remind myself of different influences that have been there, I was looking up decolonizing is not a metaphor. And I came upon an article from a non-white or an immigrant to Canada who does not identify as white, and really questioning some of the ways in which they felt placed within a set of ideas around colonization that they found some peace with eventually going through it. But anyway, I just I can share the link with you after, Denise, and maybe I don't know if there's a way to put stuff up, but it just made me think there's so many different ways to think about, as Jani mentioned earlier, positionality within this question. And of course, I bring my super white self to the table in these conversations, and there's just so many different perspectives. And yeah, in terms of being more radical, Cyrus Marcus Ware is a really big influence in my life, visual artist and social justice advocate, and just an incredible creative person. And they lead with love, and I find that to be absolutely radical. It's not my training, it's not where I come from, and I think it's such a powerful agent, and so disarming. Literally, like, to go to your love of Shakespeare, it's so like, Jani, it's so like it disarms. It can take weapons out of people's hands in such a surprising way. And so I guess for me, that's my commitment to being more radical, is to love more fully and openly. Yeah.
Beautiful.
I
Thank
guess
you.
the only other thing I'd add is, and what I often try to talk about is, and it shouldn't be radical, but sometimes it is, and that is how much better our artistic practices can be and will be if we actually do open up space for other perspectives. And it shouldn't be radical, but I think it is radical.
It is.
In that, what art are we wanting to actually lean towards and create in the future? And if we're just going to repeat and repeat and repeat sort of a model that has been used and has been successful, then the art will remain stagnant. And I like to think radically about what is possible in the future. It's already happening. I mean, there's some really interesting and amazing and beautiful artistic practices that are starting to bubble up. Or even going back to, Rebecca Belmore's work, who has been a big influence on my work too, in terms of performance art. I'm not a performance artist, but her work has been radically changed the way that I look at myself as a performer. And I just go, wow, like there is such potential for looking at artistic practice and art's perspective. If we just get rid of this idea of, I have to sacrifice something, as opposed to going, actually, if I invited it in, what might happen? What will grow out of that if we actually plant those seeds?
I just want to just say my big mantra, and something that I think was a huge agent for change with the NAC, on the path towards Indigenous theater, and then with the Anishinaabe NAC council that now exists, was it might be better.
Yeah.
It might be better.
It might be better.
It might be better.
It will be. Not even might. It will be better.
We go the next one, but yeah. Yeah.
Well, we have about 7 minutes, and I have one question, and from our audience. Can you talk about, in theater especially, if the relationship between the artists and the audience/community needs to be discussed in the context of colonialism?
Wow. I haven't had enough tea. Okay.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
it does. Everything should be talked about. If I understand the question, the relationship that the audience has to the stage is, and the relationship that the stage has had to the audience, in my recent experience, has been a bit seen. I'm going to change the topic on that. Yes, it should be discussed. If the question is coming around from the perspective of a non-Indigenous audience viewing Indigenous work, I think it's a different conversation than an Indigenous audience, even if it's Indigenous folk from a vast array of different territories. Is a very different conversation. So I guess I just have to say, yes, I think it's an area of discussion.
Wow. I guess, so I'm in that conversation right now. I just want to say, so I am touring my show Prophecy Fog, which was directed by Franco Boni, and came out of a residency at the theater center called the Tracy Wright Global Archive. And how do I want to say this without, okay, so it's a challenge. It was a challenge for me as a performer, because as a performer, I was always taught that I needed to perform. And Franco was like, just don't do that. Don't just talk to me. Just tell me the story. Just tell me the story. And so I had to go through this whole transformation as a performer too, in terms of, well, but the audience expects that of me. And Franco's like, no, they don't necessarily expect that of you. And so I had to, my whole artistic practice transformed. the other thing that's been challenging for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous audiences, the intimacy that my piece creates. Everybody sits in a circle. Everybody's involved. It's very, very intimate. The closest person in my show is, and I don't want to make it all about my show. I just want to say I'm in the middle of this conversation right now because I'm touring the show, and there's this. As soon, when I start the show and I open up my eyes and then I look around the room, I can feel everybody going, "Oh my God, I'm so close to you. Like I don't know how to be so close to you. I'm not used to this." And we all go through this moment where, and Franco's helped me create the show, where there's just a moment where I can help everybody relax into this relationship, because it's odd. It's different. It's not been experienced very often. And then the other thing that I'm finding is, because I'm touring to these various venues, we're about to head out to Gateway in Richmond, and it's a different kind of setup. It's not proscenium. It's not, and so even the technicians and the way that we set up our set, and like it's been a challenge for people to go, oh, like, so I think it's about, again, supporting artists that are interested in creating this kind of dialogue through the work. I think that the dialogue can happen through the support of artists who are, and I'm not the only one who's doing this kind of work. I think it's a great opportunity to look at work that comes from a non-colonial perspective, and but that that is not easy. I used that word that I didn't like to word about being hard and easy, but it requires a curiosity, and I'm asking people to come to my work with a curiosity, as opposed to something that's familiar and comfortable. I want them to be uncomfortable, because I want them to be curious about something that they are uncomfortable in. But yes, I think this conversation has to happen for sure, because that's what non-colonial work is going to require of the audience.
Thank you. Thank you both. You reminded me of a beautiful work. Both Sarah and I saw it in Vancouver recently as part of Push and Talking Stick. And it was by Lisa Ravensburg.
Oh, I've heard great things about it.
Seven Fire. It was like being in a ceremony.
Yeah.
It was so beautiful. And I wish everybody could see that work. So as we wrap up,
hopefully they will, if organizations
they will.
can support the touring of it and understand that in order to tour that kind of work, it might require a different kind of support.
And it does, but it's beautiful. It's an incredible experience. First, I want to go, someone asked what the video was called. It's called 3 Seconds. Sarah referenced Vanessa Andreotti's and her collective of authors, Hospicing Modernity. You can actually find this towards braiding, towards scarring, and other publications on decolonialfutures.net. And you can actually go to a YouTube channel where Vanessa walks you through hospicing modernity. There's GoodReads.com, where there's tons of books by Indigenous authors on decolonization. See films, number of free films at the NFB by the spectacular Elenice Obomsawin, who is 91 and has over 50 crucial documentaries that need to be seen. Cyrus Marcus Ware, Rebecca Belmore, Kent Monkman, Michael Grey Eyes are a few of the artists that were mentioned. see shows. If prophecy fog is in your area, please, I highly recommend you see it. I'm going to share one more quote from Richard. Keep what's true in front of you, old man said. You won't get lost that way. I was asking about making my way through the bush. He was talking about making my way through life. Turns out, all these years later, it was the same conversation.
Mm.
So keep what's true in front of you. Thank you so much, Chimigwich, Jani, and Sarah. I feel like we've only touched on this topic, and I feel like we really, really need a second webinar to this one.
I'm also trying to find that film and I can't find it. So maybe I've gotten the name wrong. But I was pretty sure it was called 3 Seconds, but now I don't know where it is. Then there's a bunch of other films that are coming up with that name, and it's not the one I'm suggesting, but it's a young Black actor. He's sitting on a beach, and I will try to find it and send that off to you. Anyway.
The links and reading suggestions will be in the show notes of the archives of this session on the ACCA's YouTube channel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Denise.
Thanks,
And
Denise.
thank you, Sue and Victoria, for
everyone.
Thank
bringing
you,
us-
guys. Thank you, Peter Herdnoff.
Yes. Oh,
Chimiquinch.
Yeah.
Much love. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.